So thank you very much. Welcome to this workshop about the global jihad, which couldn't be more timely given recent events in Libya and other places. And what we are trying to do today, next 3 hours, is to look at this from different angles and to look at it from local perspectives. We're going to talk about different places in the world and how Al-Qaeda and jihadist groups are doing there. And we're also looking at Al-Qaeda and jihadist groups in general and how they are developing. What I'm hoping to do is to get the presentations out of the way until 11 o'clock, give you a little break, and then we have a full and frank discussion, as they say. So we'll start off with Shiraz Maher, who is currently writing an intellectual history of Al-Qaeda, exploring the development of its political thought by drawing on hitherto unexamined material. Shiraz is one of my colleagues at ICSR at King's College London, and he will give us an overview of where he thinks Al-Qaeda is.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction, Peter. I want to talk about this presentation really in just 4 big terms. And by way of signposting, I'll let you know what those are. The first is to talk about Qaeda Central. That would be its core command and so on. To talk about then its regional affiliates. To talk about the Arab Spring and the opportunities that has presented to Al-Qaeda and more generally to the global jihad movement. And then to talk a little bit about the periphery and what we think is taking place there. And in doing so, I don't want to touch too much on the stuff that you will have heard Peter talk about in the plenary, so I'll be trying to build on some of that and look at it in the broader context. All in 12 minutes. So if I speak quickly, bear with me. It doesn't take me to tell you, I'm sure, that Al-Qaeda Central, as we know now, is pretty badly beaten. It's stunned at the moment, not just with the loss of Osama bin Laden last year, but of course more broadly with the loss of a number of leaders who have been taken out by drone strikes, Mustafa Abu Yazid, Abu Yahya al-Libi, and so on. And this has left the Central Command much weaker and smaller than it has possibly ever been in the past. We also find that, of course, Al-Qaeda is being squeezed at the moment, not just with the ongoing war in Afghanistan, but also with pressures receiving from Pakistan in what, for better or for worse, has been called the AFPAC strategy. And a lot of the fighting now contained to what is the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, the small sliver of land that exists autonomously between Pakistan, although it's nominally part of it, and Afghanistan too. Of course, this isn't the first time a group like Al-Qaeda has taken big hits in this way or suffered the loss of leadership in this manner. And one of its most enduring features is that it has around it a very resilient ideological infrastructure which is able in many senses to self-generate, to withstand a lot of the pressures that it faces militarily. And of course you don't kill ideologies by force. And so it remains to be seen how we can sort of look to curtail the influence of some of that. What also struck me possibly as quite interesting is the relationship Pakistan has and what impact that will have on its relationship with Al-Qaeda. And there are going to be elections next year in Pakistan. It looks like most likely there will be some change of government. And of course any incoming new administration will bring with it a new set of political will. And whether that political will increases in terms of its desire to cooperate with the West or decreases that, I think we could see things play out there. So that's somewhat interesting. Then, looking at the regional affiliates, of course, probably the most potent one is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It's demonstrated over the last few years an increased willingness and ability to strike at the West, whether those have been failed attacks, such as Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the cartridge bomb plots that we've seen. It remains probably the most dynamic and potent chapter of Al-Qaeda that exists today. Of course, again, like Al-Qaeda Central, it's been suffering attacks from drone strikes. Anwar al-Awlaki, who was taken out by a strike, and just the other day, Saeed al-Shihri was taken out on Monday, so the second in command of AQAP. So again, we see that there is a concerted pressure on the group there by way of military strategy to confine its leadership. Perhaps more than Al-Qaeda Central, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula pioneered the idea, or let's say mastered the idea, of developing and pushing the ideological message, mostly through the magazine that I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of called Inspire. And what Inspire did was to essentially give people a toolkit to become self-starting jihadists, to operate as what's called lone wolves, and there are ICSR publications looking at that. If you're interested, you can get them from our website. And this lone wolf strategy builds on what one of the key Al-Qaeda theorists, Abu Musab al-Suri, had first said, that in theory everyone should be an army of one, and that the sort of Muslim Ummah should operate in this way. And so that was part of his strategy. And if you look at what they've been saying, it's very interesting. They've talked about moving away from sophisticated, coordinated attacks that we've seen previously on September the 11th, on 7/7, that kind of thing. They're really saying, just make it very basic, make it very simple. And one of those people inspired by this message was Roshna Chowdhury, who just stabbed a member of parliament in an attempt to kill him, but failed. And so I developed what I call essentially like the Nike Jihad, essentially just do it, and that's the sort of philosophy behind some of this. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, we're seeing again increasingly resurgent, fueled by the sectarian conflict in Syria. I'll touch on Syria a bit in a minute, but we've seen provinces like Anbar become again increasingly tense, and so there's the Syrian dynamic playing into some of that, and again it remains to be seen quite how that affects the future of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, well, it's the one we know the least about. It's the one that I also know the least about. But I think what's interesting there is one of the unintended consequences of military action in Libya, for example, has been that a lot of the arms from there have found their way into Mali, for example, and found their ways into the hands of Islamist groups operating there. So again, this is part of increasing destabilization within the region. And of course, as Peter mentioned, the death of the ambassador yesterday, there is a view, it's not yet established, that there may have been a coordinated and planned jihadist attack rather than a reaction to this film that's supposed to have come out of California recently. So again, if the killing of the ambassador was linked to that, that would be a pretty clear signal, not necessarily that Al-Qaeda is behind it, but that jihadists within the region are feeling pretty empowered and emboldened to go and launch an attack of that sort. To touch on the Arab Spring briefly, well, it's created some opportunities for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Islamic Maghreb of the kind that I just described: increased political instability and, I suppose, not on governed spaces in the traditional sense, but in the chaos, these groups are finding nooks and crannies within which to operate and within which to express themselves to a greater degree. Syria, of course, is at the moment probably the key battleground for a lot of these groups. The instability there that's raged for well over a year now has created space for jihadists to operate. Groups such as Jabha al-Nusra are operating there freely, and again, it remains to be seen, I suppose, what would happen in a post-Assad Syria as to whether those jihadist organizations are the ones that decisively tip the balance, whether they're not, what role they would play in the future, what their relationship is with the FSA. And of course, a lot of it at the moment is guesswork as to what's behind all of this. And it's difficult to speak of it in monolithic terms. It's, I think, a rapidly changing and very nuanced picture on the ground there. The most interesting thing, though, I think about the Arab Spring, and this doesn't relate to Al-Qaeda per se, or necessarily even jihadist groups, but is the way the Arab Spring has presented an opportunity for political Islam to change and morph. Whereas before, for example, within Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was a banned organization. Therefore, by definition, to be a member of the Brotherhood meant you operated outside of the law. You were considered illegitimate by the state. Now, these groups are not just empowered, but operate legally, constitutionally, within the framework of the state, and as a result, have garnered the legitimacy conferred through the electoral process. And that, I think, is a very fascinating development. And we see, as I say, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Nahda in Tunisia, various groups within Libya as well that are operating now within the new contours of the Middle East in that way. And again, it remains to be seen how they take this forward in the long run and what the impact is there. To touch very briefly then on the periphery, I think the key dynamic here is probably going to be ungoverned spaces and the political will in those regions for change and for the chaos that might result from increased jihadist activity. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, as it's known, for example, continues to operate within the tribal areas. There is no political will really within Pakistan to challenge them militarily. Pakistan favors a policy of engagement and striking peace deals with the TTP. So that's one dynamic you see on the ground there. There are jihadists, of course, in the Horn of Africa and, of course, across the Sahel as well, which is a region now where there has been, again, post-Arab Spring, a proliferation of arms, of groups, and so on. And I won't touch too much on the Horn of Africa. Suffice to say, of course, that Al-Shabaab is the possibly the most important group there. But my colleague Alexander will talk a lot more about what Al-Shabaab are doing and what's happening in the Horn of Africa. So I'll stop there. I think I was on time. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiraz, for this overview. Shiraz, can you just say, overall, is Al-Qaeda up or down?
I would say Al-Qaeda is in strategic decline, as you said the other day.
Mm-hmm.
But to carry that phrase on, threats in strategic decline can do a lot of damage still on their way down. So that's my view.
Okay, thank you. So our next speaker is an old friend of mine, Assaf Moghadam, who is now one of the many stars of ICT. He's a senior lecturer at the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy at IDC. You're not actually at ICT, is that? Both. Okay. And a senior researcher at I hadn't gotten to there yet. A senior researcher at ICT. Previously, he was assistant professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he served as senior associate at the Combating Terrorism Center, and subsequently as director of terrorism studies. And as I understand, Assaf, you will talk about how Al-Qaeda innovates. So we look forward to that. Thank you.
So my talk is based on a 50-page paper, which is currently under review. So I've been struggling with cutting it down to 30 minutes, and I'm going to be doing my best to keep it down to 10 minutes today. But essentially what I do in this paper is, first of all, I identify a research gap. It's not that I identify it, but the field knows that there is a research gap in the study of terrorist innovation. Terrorist innovation has been very much an under-investigated topic. According to one of the doyens of the field, Leonard Weinberg, he says, for example, that that terrorist innovation is underrated. He highlighted terrorist innovation as one of two main under-investigated research areas within the field. Even by 2011, for example, there were only three book-length treatments of the topic of terrorist innovation. Perhaps the most famous of these is a book by Adam Dolnick called Terrorist Innovation. I forgot, but a book published by Routledge by Adam Dolnick is the main piece. Now that this lacuna in the research of terrorist innovation is actually puzzling, because for one reason that this is puzzling is that there, of course, have been major advances in the research of other areas related to terrorism since 9/11. A second reason is that actually, if we look at strategic studies, there have been major advances done in the study of military innovation in the last 10 years, building on the work of such important people as Barry Posen or Stephen Peter Rosen. But there has not been any translation of that progress into the terrorism studies field. And third, of course, is also that this is a very, very important and policy-relevant topic. According to Weinberg, again, innovative terrorist groups seem to be exceptionally dangerous. what he also says is that organizations engaged in counterterrorism might well focus their strongest efforts on disrupting the operations of the most innovative groups. Now, of course, Al-Qaeda, one reason that I decided to focus on Al-Qaeda is that Al-Qaeda is, of course, oftentimes cited as according to Daniel Byman, for example, an unusually innovative terrorist group, or Bruce Hoffman calls it nimble, adaptive, right? We all know these terms about Al-Qaeda. So what do I do in this research? First of all, the main objective of this research is to advance the theoretical debate on terrorist innovation. It's both theoretically and empirically underdeveloped, but my main effort is really to advance the theoretical debate, but also in the process to inform practical knowledge of innovation in Al-Qaeda. So my research question really is, how does Al-Qaeda innovate? And the approach that I take in my work is I apply one of the main models of military innovation studies, and I adopt that model to the study of terrorist innovation. Now, the model that I adopt is actually, I looked at the main debate. What is the main debate nowadays in military innovation studies, right? And the main debate is a question of is innovation directed from the top down, from the leadership of organizations, or is innovation directed actually, are processes of innovation coming from the bottom up, right? So it's this debate of bottom-up innovation versus top-down innovation. That's the main debate right now in military innovation studies, and I wanted to see to which extent does Al-Qaeda, for example, innovate from the top down or from the bottom up. And so what I did, I focused on the case of 9/11 to look, because for various reasons. But so in terms of my methodology, I take it's of course interdisciplinary, because I seek to bridge military innovation studies and terrorist innovation studies. I use a single case study approach, which is of course somewhat problematic, but it's good actually to formulate new hypotheses. Why do I focus on Al-Qaeda? For reasons I already mentioned, it's usually cited as a highly innovative group. But there's another reason actually to focus on Al-Qaeda for this particular research question that I have in mind, which is again this top-down versus bottom-up. And that's because actually there is still an ongoing debate about whether Al-Qaeda is led from the top or led from the bottom, right? Al-Qaeda is cited by some people as being decentralized and by others as being steered from the top down, right? The famous Hoffman-Sageman debate. So in other words, the question of whether Al-Qaeda is centralized or decentralized has not yet been fully settled, and that makes it for a perfect case study to actually look at top-down versus bottom-up innovation, because there is no a priori determination of if, for example, I would have selected Sendero Luminoso as a case study, it would have been much, much more likely, but it was a very centralized organization under Abimael Guzman. It would have been far more likely that they would have found evidence for top-down innovation as opposed to bottom-up. With Al-Qaeda, it's essentially an open question. Why did I focus on the 9/11 attacks? Because if you use single case studies, the more information you have, the better. And of course, 9/11 remains one of the most investigated terrorist attacks in history. The 9/11 Commission report is a treasure trove of information in and of itself. So, of course, the first thing I had to do is actually to argue or to show that Al-Qaeda, that the 9/11 attacks is an act of innovation. And here I stumbled across a number of definitional problems, because there's actually no consensus definition of terrorist innovation. But everybody agrees that the 9/11 attacks is essentially a tactical or technological innovation. And that's because the 9/11 attacks were the first, and please, if I'm wrong on this, I hope I'll be corrected here. I hope I won't be, but to the best of my knowledge, Al-Qaeda, the 9/11 attacks was the first successfully executed terrorist attack in which multiple airliners were hijacked and subsequently crashed onto targets. Now, airliners were hijacked before, multiple airliners were hijacked before, airliners were crashed or were detonated on the ground, right? But the combination of these incidents has not happened, at least not in a terrorist attack. There was, for example, a case of Frank Eugene Corder, who took a Cessna and crashed it into the White House, but this was not a terrorist attack. This was the act of an individual loner. In terms of strategic innovation, Martha Crenshaw makes a distinction between tactical, organizational, and strategic innovation. She argues that 9/11 is also a strategic innovation. I tend to disagree a bit, because to me, an innovation has to actually be followed by a change in the operational praxis of the particular method or technique. And with the 9/11 attacks, it's still too early to tell whether the 9/11 attacks changed the operational praxis of terrorism on the ground. At least it's arguable. But at the very least, it's a tactical innovation. There's very little doubt about it. So again, I take the main model of military innovation, the main debate in military innovation studies, top-down models of innovation and bottom-up models of innovation. Top-down models of innovation essentially suggest that innovation in organizations is centrally directed by military leaders or by civilian leaders. Right? They essentially come up with the idea or with the need to innovate, and then they direct that innovation, and then it kind of cascades down into the organization. Bottom-up model. Now, the traditional models of innovation in the literature of strategic studies, they are all top-down models. Right? I'm not going to go into details for lack of time, but in recent years, and especially the campaigns, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, have given new impetus to models of bottom-up innovation, which are actually focusing on the unit level, meaning you have military units fighting on the ground, and in the course of the fighting, there is a need for them to innovate, right? And so so there has been growing attention placed by some scholars like Theo Farrell, Adam Grissom, and others on these bottom-up models of innovation. So I looked at 9/11. What kind of evidence did I find for whether the innovation of 9/11 has been a top-down issue or a bottom-up issue? So to make a long story short, I found more evidence that there was top-down innovation in the case of 9/11. For example, Al-Qaeda's organizational goals, right? Its determined desire to hit the United States was actually a main driver of innovation. Again, I can't get into too much details here, but the second point is bin Laden's leadership skills. He was a person who was able to make difficult decisions, right? According to KSM, for example, in interrogation reports, he selected the 9/11 bombers within 10 minutes, in less than 10 minutes. He was also a very pragmatic person, right? For example, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the actual innovator, right, the actual inventor of the 9/11 attacks, he had originally a much more megalomaniacal plan in mind for the 9/11 attacks. He wanted to hijack about 15 airliners. He wanted to land the last one in Washington and make a huge pronouncement. But bin Laden actually took Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's plan, adopted it, but then he made it into a more pragmatic, operationalizable plan. So he was a pragmatic person, and that's also an important kind of piece of evidence for top-down innovation. And then also there was a tenacious pursuit of goals on the part of bin Laden, meaning that there was a lot of resistance to bin Laden, even from within his own organization, to go ahead with the 9/11 attacks. There was, of course, also resistance on the part of Taliban leader Mullah Omar, but bin Laden went ahead anyway, right? So there were important top-down aspects of this decision. Al-Qaeda also has what I call a martyrdom complex, right? Al-Qaeda has always been very bent on using martyrdom operations, what it calls martyrdom operations, as part of its tactic, which is an innovation in itself, right? It was an innovation. Its adoption in the early 1980s by Hezbollah was an innovation in itself. And Al-Qaeda was also obsessed with airline attacks, and you can argue it still is obsessed, at least until recent years. So all of these are evidence of top-down innovation. What about possible evidence of bottom-up factors of innovation in the 9/11 attacks? And here I found 3 possible factors, which I then had to look at in more detail in order to determine, is that really a case of bottom-up innovation? Well, the first was receptivity to proposals for terrorist attacks, right? And one of the things that Al-Qaeda has done, for which it is very widely known, is it has solicited in some cases, or at least has been very open and receptive to getting proposals for nice terrorist attacks, right? And that's how the planes operation of 9/11 came about. And that is not true for every other terrorist organization, which are usually very jealously guarding their own operations and so forth. So this is a possible bottom-up factor of innovation. There's also the issue of trial and error. So again, if you look at the way that bottom-up innovation is usually defined in the military innovation literature, it's military units on the ground who improvise on the ground. Well, there's some of that in the 9/11 attacks, because the 9/11 attacks, there was improvisation. There was also trial and error on the part of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Youssef. The famous Bujinka plot, for example, was essentially kind of an early trial run or an early version of the idea that ended up being 9/11. So here you can also argue that it's kind of a trial and error which led up slowly from the bottom up to end up in the 9/11 attacks. Okay. And then finally, centralization of decision, decentralization of execution. This is something which is also very interesting because Al-Qaeda has a kind of an operational strategy that the central leadership makes strategic decisions and then it lets other middle-ranking officers actually execute the operations. So we also see this particular issue in the case of Al-Qaeda. So to conclude, there was evidence of both top-down drivers of innovation in Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda goals and ideology, its leadership skill, bin Laden's leadership skills, and so forth. There was very clear evidence of bottom-up drivers of innovation. I think, in my case, in my opinion, when it comes to the trial and error, right? The Bojinka plot. But then there were also, I think, when it comes to the receptivity for proposals of terrorist attacks and to the issue of centralization of decision and decentralization of execution, in my mind, these are processes of innovation that don't fall neatly into the established categories of top-down versus bottom-up innovation. In other words, what I do in my paper is I also kind of what I show is that the traditional distinction or the current debate in the military innovation studies of top-down versus bottom-up innovation, the distinction between those two can sometimes be very, very opaque. And what I find is that there are some processes of innovation that are integrative in the sense that they depend actually on the confluence of both top-down and bottom-up elements, right? For example, the receptivity to proposal for terrorist attacks. It depends on having a senior leadership that makes a decision to open up the organization to ideas for attacks. But at the same time, it also depends on innovative ideas coming from the bottom, right? And so I call these integrative drivers of innovation. And there's some implications for theory and policy, which I think I'm not going to go into that, but maybe I can answer that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So talk. Thank you very much, Assaf. And now we're moving on to one of the, now affiliate groups of Al-Qaeda, namely Shabaab in Somalia. And this is a topic that my colleague Meleagrou-Hitchens has investigated very deeply and very consistently. As I said, he's a research fellow at ICSR. His main area of study is the growth and success of English-speaking Salafi jihadist ideologues in the West. And perhaps most relevant to this is the fact that he's just returned from Kenya, where he has conducted field work and spoken to a lot of former Shabaab fighters and has, in that way, a first-hand impression of what is happening right now in Somalia. Alex.
Thanks, Peter. First, it's worth noting, as we've already seen, that although the global jihad movement and Al-Qaeda are reeling from sort of repeated and sustained attacks on their leadership and on their ideology, it still has a number of sort of irons in the fire. Shiraz has told us about those that they have in the Middle East, and I'll have a little look at those that they have in Africa and how they're trying to establish themselves in the Horn of Africa, in particular Kenya and Somalia. I'll also look at how Africa has responded to this problem, and particularly because it's a big problem, a big threat to their very lucrative tourism industries, to a number of the countries, regional countries around Somalia. And by looking a little bit about the time at the issue of the Western homegrown terrorism threat, because it's quite a relevant subject for this conference, and just to sort of kick off maybe a question and answer session later. So, as Pakistan and Afghanistan have become sort of less reliable safe havens recently, we've seen this refocus on Africa. Shabaab and other groups in the region have benefited from experience of key jihadist leaders like Fazul Abdullah Muhammad, who was killed in June 2011, and Saleh Ali Nabhan, killed in September 2009. Both of these men were involved with Al-Qaeda really since its inception. They have a very strong jihadist pedigree, and they were very able to really show a lot of these groups how you can operate effectively. The long history of jihadism in Africa, we know about the twin embassy bombings in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, which of course Nabhan and Fazul were involved with organizing. So it's not a new thing to Africa by any means. We're seeing a sort of growing logistical support network throughout Eastern and Central Africa. Carter Ham, U.S. Africa Command's the head of U.S. Africa Command, has told us about links between Al-Shabaab and Nigeria's Boko Haram, as well as links with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. We also know that Shabaab have claimed links with Yemen's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Al-Qaeda will be, or rather the global jihad, will be looking to bolster this network in order to strengthen its prospects in the region and build resilience against African and Western efforts to combat them. As we've seen recently, as we've heard, as many of you probably have heard recently, Al-Shabaab is having a hard time at the moment in Somalia. They've lost many of their strongholds to the African Union mission in Somalia, the AMISOM group, and they're just about holding on to one of their last strongholds, the port city of Kismayo. They're likely to lose the battle for this city quite soon, and have already begun morphing from a governing body, which was implementing the Sharia, into a insurgency. Fighters have melted back into local clan militias in a way that we saw possibly after 9/11 in Afghanistan, how a lot of Taliban members went back into their tribes. And from here, they're able to avoid capture much easier and carry on a more unconventional war. As it has weakened, however, Al-Shabaab has begun to lash out at a lot of the regional countries that are involved in the AMISOM mission. We saw the Kampala bombings in Uganda in July 2010 when fans were watching the World Cup final, killed 74. We've seen grenade attacks. We must have heard a lot about them in Mombasa and Nairobi. And a recent church massacre in Garissa, which is a small Kenyan village that borders Somalia, that killed 15 in July of this year. It was on a small church gathering there. I believe that Shabaab will continue to coordinate attacks on these regional players, and is also pursuing a strategy to stir up these sort of latent sectarian tensions between Christians and the majority Christian populations and Muslims, and hope to sort of cause sort of destabilize in a similar way that Zarqawi did in Iraq by trying to foment a civil war between the Sunnis and the Shias. How are they doing this? How are they effectively operating in places like Kenya? We've seen they've built up local networks there, mainly based around the slums of Eastleigh, which is made up of the Somali Kenyan diaspora, and slightly more surprisingly in Majengo, which is in the Pumwani area of Nairobi, and that is a majority Kenyan area. We're phenomenon of Kenyan Muslims being radicalized. And this is not really in the history of Kenyan Islam, much like Somalia before the Islamic Courts Union started taking control. The history of the kind of Islam that you've seen in Africa is not really related to the Salafi jihadism of Al-Qaeda. It's much more spiritual. So it's quite a new and very interesting phenomenon that Kenyans are being drafted in now. The group that's mainly doing this is in Majengo. It's called the Pumwani Muslim Youth Center. They're funded by a combination of Middle Eastern and European donors, particularly from the British Somali diaspora, where we have a number of successful businessmen who have been found to be channeling money there. They have taken advantage of sort of the grinding poverty in these slums, and they're luring young men with promises of monthly wages that are up to 4 times the national average, and promising assistance to their families once they've gone to Somalia to fight. Once they've been lured in, they go through a number of indoctrination programs. These were until recently led by an individual called Abu Drogo. He was recently killed in a drive-by shooting as part of what many believe is a Kenyan government extrajudicial killing program. A number of leading Kenyan Shabaab recruiters have either disappeared or been killed in very mysterious circumstances, shall we say. This was also done by a man called Ahmed Iman Ali. I think we'll be hearing a lot more about him in the near future. He's now the commander of a number of non-Somali al-Shabaab contingents in Somalia, from where he still produces propaganda videos and recruitment videos. and he's something of a rising star. He's very popular with East African jihadists, and he's something of the Anwar al-Awlaki of East Africa. As Peter said, I had the opportunity to interview a number of these Kenyan former Shabaab fighters, and I found out a lot of things. That these guys had fled, actually, after they realized that they'd been lured in by with false promises. They never received any of the money they were promised, and they realized that even though they were told they were going to go and help the local Muslim population, they realized that what they were going there to do was to kill, rob, and basically force local populations into accepting Shabaab control. Half of them that I spoke to actually had joined for purely financial reasons. They had no work. It was something akin to joining the sort of national army. It was a way for them to get paid, and they were totally honest about that. The other half, however, did tell me that they joined after meeting Abu Drogo or Ahmed Iman Ali, and were completely sold on the idea of global jihad by them. They were very impressed by, as they mentioned, the iman of these men, the strong faith shown by these guys and the knowledge that they had, and they were overwhelmed often by these men. Just a quick anecdote of one of the guys I spoke to. He was 16 when he joined the group with a friend of his, and this was after meeting Ahmed Iman Ali, and he told me just how much he really loved the preacher, and he was almost like a brother to him, he said, and he seemed to care about my family a lot, and he's always concerned about me, and he had this great knowledge of Islam, and he was really completely sort of taken in by him. Then once he went to Somalia to fight with Al-Shabaab, his opinion began to change fairly drastically after seeing how the group treated its members. He described to me how he saw his friends slaughtered in front of him after disobeying an order, and he actually broke down in tears at that point, and he told me, "I thought he was my brother," he told me of Ali. "Now I realize he's the devil." This is likely to be the experience of a lot of current Shabaab fighters. A lot of them are looking for a way out, I believe, and they've struggled actually recently to stem the tide of defectors, and they're going to need to address this if they're going to ensure their own survival. They're also going to need to maintain the funding streams that they have, as this is a crucial part of their recruitment strategy. Just to look very briefly at the AMISOM mission. How much time do we have? AMISOM, as I said, is the African Union mission in Somalia, and this is really I'd like to sort of discuss a little bit of how and why they have been quite a successful response to this problem. They were formed in February 2007 and are mandated until the beginning of 2013 to assist the Transitional Federal Government, TFG, in Somalia and its successor, the National Constituent Assembly, the NCA, in their efforts to fight Al-Shabaab. It's been in the country since March 2007. It's made up of troops from Uganda, Kenya, Burundi, Djibouti, and Sierra Leone. A turning point for this mission was in August 2011 when AMISOM troops, particularly the Djiboutian and Burundian elements, together with TFG forces, took Mogadishu from the control of Al-Shabaab. And in the recent months, we've seen that AMISOM has made the most of that. They've remained on the offensive, and we've seen members augmented by troops also from Ethiopia who are not actually part of AMISOM, but they've re-entered the fray as well. The AMISOM mission has been received very well by regional as well as other actors who are interested in ensuring that Al-Qaeda doesn't strengthen in the region. And while it's undoubtedly receiving foreign and especially American assistance, it's very important to stress this is a body made up of African troops who have responded to an African problem at the direction of an African political organization. African Union members have shown a willingness and desire to act swiftly and largely independently to ensure their own national security and protect the lucrative tourism industries that I mentioned. In addition, Burundi and Ugandan soldiers who cleared out Mogadishu are now thought to be among the best urban warfare soldiers in the continent and maybe in the world, and this will, I'm sure, come to some use again in the future as they begin to face up to their Al-Qaeda problem. As I mentioned before, AMISOM are now undertaking an offensive in Kismayo, the port city, and it's the last remaining Shabaab stronghold. This port holds a tremendous strategic importance as the financial lifeblood of Al-Shabaab. For some time, Al-Shabaab has generated a lot of funds by taxing the production, transport, and export of charcoal in the region. Kismayo is the home to the country's main port, from which the coal is exported to Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE. Shutting down this significant stream of income is really one of the main military concerns or objectives of AMISOM, and I think we're likely to see that in the next month or so if everything goes to plan. As we think about the future of Al-Qaeda, and in this case its future in Africa, I think the African Union is going to play a really crucial role in how successful Al-Qaeda's attempts are in putting down deep roots on the continent. Just briefly, moving slightly off subject back to the Western homegrown terrorism issue, which I think we'll talk about later in a bit after the presentations. But it's worth just considering this, that through its online activities and numerous and affiliated sympathetic media organizations that we're seeing online, what we've seen is sort of, and the promotion of this lone wolf jihadism issue or strategy, we've seen Al-Qaeda they've sought to lower the bar on what it means to be part of the global jihad movement, or what it means to be a jihadist. This has ensured that perhaps they've increased their support base, because before, what it really meant to be a jihadist, say before 9/11, was you were in Afghanistan and Pakistan training with them, or you were fighting in one of the number of fronts of jihad. That's what it meant. Now you can sit at your computer, produce some video, or follow these forums and feel as if you're part of this movement. This has advantages and disadvantages. It's perhaps increased the support base in the West, but it's also sort of just how, if you go to a restaurant, sometimes you try and get the ketchup and you realize that it's been diluted just to stretch it out a little bit. This is sort of what you're seeing here. They're diluting the movement, and they're diluting the effectiveness, and so we might see a bigger interest in attacks and a bigger interest in carrying out attacks in the West, but we're also likely to see lower impact, a lower level of effectiveness of these attacks, because they never had the opportunity to get that kind of training that they needed. So possible high volume, but low impact, if at worst, I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and I'm sure we're going to hear you talking a lot more about some of the field work you've done and some of the insights you have, because this is something that a lot of people talk about, but not a lot of people know a lot about, and you're really quite unique in that respect. Our next presenter is Don Rassler, who is an instructor in the Department of Social Sciences and director of the Harmony Research Program at the Combating Terrorism Center at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. His research interests are the Haqqani network, the early history of Al-Qaeda, and the changing dynamics of Afghanistan's and Pakistan's military militant landscapes, and this is indeed the topic that he will talk to us about.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to the IDC, ICT for this invite, to the team from IC, SR for allowing me to be on your panel. It's an honor to be here. So we're presented with this question of where is the global jihad headed, Al-Qaeda. And we naturally gravitate, as the focus of this panel attests, to Al-Qaeda as a way to understand this issue. Such an approach is understandable, as any assessment of the future of the global jihad would be wholly incomplete without the inclusion of Al-Qaeda. Yet such an approach, as we can all recognize, is also limited, as our narrow focus on Al-Qaeda obscures other important dynamics. I'll argue that it's more helpful to think about global jihad as a system, with there being various inputs and aspects and dimensions which we need to consider, especially when we think about the future. With that in mind, and to the extent that I'm able in 10 minutes, I plan to provide a general assessment of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and evaluate the current and future state of Al-Qaeda in relation to other factors of change there, particularly related to Pakistan's Sunni militant landscape. So to start with, in terms of Al-Qaeda, several other people have already touched on this throughout this conference, so I'll be brief with what I'm going to say here. it's helpful to think about it in terms of challenges and what's not working for Al-Qaeda and what is working for Al-Qaeda in the region. So to start with challenges, clearly there's the demise of Osama bin Laden and the central charismatic personality that he embodied, the removal of other leaders, individuals like Abu Mustafa al-Yazid, Atiyah Abu Yahya al-Libi, and Yunus al-Mauritani, as well as other individuals specifically associated with Al-Qaeda's external operations. Al-Qaeda's status will be even more unclear after the death, arrest, or removal of Ayman al-Zawahiri. Al-Qaeda has also had low numbers in Afghanistan. And these aspects, coupled with the inability of Al-Qaeda to launch major external attacks, have led some to conclude that the group is slowly sliding into irrelevance. Al-Qaeda is also troubled by internal issues which compound these problems, specifically Al-Qaeda's lack of control over its affiliates, Al-Qaeda is suffering from the consequences of its own decisions, particularly related to Iraq and its decision to formally affiliate with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the impact that these dynamics have had on Al-Qaeda's brand. There are also situational or external variables that are affecting Al-Qaeda, most notably, as we have discussed in this conference, the Arab Spring, and as Peter put yesterday, with the dynamic of the Arab Spring and the change in the Middle East that has inspired, being almost a complete rejection of Al-Qaeda's violent methodology. These dynamics and other issues have led to the fracturing of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it remains an open question as to whether or not Al-Qaeda will survive as a coherent or viable entity there. It's also unclear if Al-Qaeda's center of gravity will remain in the region or move elsewhere. With these pressures, it's also not certain if Al-Qaeda and its partners can avoid infighting, and whether Al-Qaeda's experiment in global jihadism will lose ground to more parochial or local interests. So, when viewed in aggregate, these factors have led some to write Al-Qaeda off, and to state that the group is 1 to 2 leaders away from being obsolete. There are many reasons why we can't write Al-Qaeda off, because Al-Qaeda, if anything, has proven itself to be resilient. Declassified documents from Osama bin Laden's Abbottabad compound illustrate that the group is committed, as we have long known, to a broader endgame. We specifically see in these documents bin Laden calling to move individuals to more remote and rugged areas in Afghanistan, places like Kunar and Nuristan province, as well as to move some of their operatives out of the Fatah to lay low and try and refit. Al-Qaeda has also historically been good at seeking out and recognizing opportunities, another factor which leads us to really to suggest that these dynamics cannot be overlooked. There's also the issue of Al-Qaeda's remaining seasoned members. While small in force, it cannot be entirely written off. These include personalities like Saif al-Adil, Adnan Shukr Juma, and the group's middle managers and young Turks who have come of age over the last 10 years, individuals who are likely known to counterterrorism operators, but not the public, who will play a role in shaping the future trajectory of the group. There's also the aspect of the next generation of Al-Qaeda, and the potential role played by family members of deceased senior Al-Qaeda militants such as bin Laden's son Hamza. And while it's not a certainty that these individuals will be involved in militancy, their potential role could not be discounted at this point. Perhaps most importantly is the impact or legacy of 11 years of war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Al-Qaeda's continued presence in the region for the past 10 years, even if in small pockets, has also helped to ensure that the group's membership is now more local and potentially more deeply intermarried and interwoven into the tapestry of each place. Although an understudied phenomenon, Al-Qaeda has always had a Pakistani current running through its membership, and it is therefore not unreasonable to assume that any future version of the group, or whatever potentially replaces it, will be markedly more Pakistani. An uptick in Urdu language videos released by Al-Qaeda's media arm, As-Sahab, targeted 2 Pakistanis, and a series of attacks allegedly involving insiders in Pakistan's military indicates that such a future is one that the group is actively working to cultivate. These dynamics suggest that the next generation of Al-Qaeda in the region could look much more different than the first and be even more integrated than Al-Qaeda already is with other Afghan and Pakistani militant groups. At a policy level, such a dynamic does not bode well for the future of U.S.-Pakistani relations, especially if spoilers in Pakistan triumph over forces urging moderation. So if we're to pull back a little bit, I think it's also helpful to think about the future of Al-Qaeda and the global jihad in terms of the changes that we've observed in Pakistan's Sunni militant landscape. There are clearly a variety of different changes. It's a diverse and incredibly complicated landscape. But from a U.S. counterterrorism perspective, I think there are 2 important changes that stand out. The first is the dynamic of ideological hybridization, whereby we have observed a higher percentage of militant groups in Pakistan describing their fight in terms that are ideologically similar to Al-Qaeda since 9/11. This would specifically include groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Harakat al-Jihad Islami, Huji, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and Sipah-e-Sahaba, and to some extent Lashkar-e-Taiba. Now, as Thomas Haghammer is correct to point out, ideological hybridization between jihadi groups in Pakistan and elsewhere has always been an issue, so in that sense, it's not really something new. What I would argue, though, what is new is that it appears to be is the extent of hybridization that's occurring or the intensity of it. The second major change in Pakistan's Sunni militant landscape since 9/11 is the further blurring of organizational boundaries between groups. Militant groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan have always been interlinked, but pressure placed on many of them post-2001, at least for some, has constrained the space in which they can operate and has led to their co-location, greater intermingling, and sharing of resources and space. And while defining membership and establishing borders between organizations is and has always been a problem in the terrorism field, this task has become even more challenging in Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last several years, given what we know about their cooperation and overlap. It is not uncommon to have members of disrupted or successful terror cells start with one group, get trained by another, and then end up acting upon the direction of yet another group. The cases of Faisal Shahzad, Najibul Azazi, and many other jihadis serve as important examples in this regard. So what are the implications? What do these dynamics and changes in Pakistan's militant landscape tell us? I'll suggest there are three policy implications. The first is that the blending of ideologies and groups makes it that much more difficult to tease them apart, with CT analysts and investigators increasingly need to be more fluent in multiple groups. This is a challenge, particularly in the U.S., given how our CT squads are usually organized via specific groups, because it's likely that the threat of global jihad or transnational terrorism will likely have many different organizational inputs, as we have already observed over the last several years. The second implication is that while the U.S. has made progress in degrading Al-Qaeda and decapitating its leadership, we also need to recognize that due to these issues, the dynamic of global jihad is a broader and now more distributed phenomenon that extends well beyond Al-Qaeda. Third, these changes have impacted the targeting of militant groups in the region, and as a result, what we're likely to see in the future. In the past, many of these groups have had clearer enemy hierarchies, and we're seeing that this is increasingly less so. What we're observing today are more hybrid organizations with hybrid ideologies leading to hybrid targets, with the attacks in Mumbai serving as a good example or model for the future. So then, who are these groups beyond Al-Qaeda that we need to consider and think about in terms of global jihad? There's many ways to approach this question, and I would suggest that there are three categories of groups that we need to evaluate and learn more about. The first are local Pakistani and Afghan players, what we could describe as anti-Kashmir or sectarian militant groups in Pakistan that are in transition. I mentioned some of them already. I'll call attention to Jaish-e-Mohammed, Huji, Sipah-e-Sahaba, and Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Lashkar-e-Taiba. These groups have gravitated more towards Al-Qaeda's orbit. Some have flown under the radar, and from a U.S. perspective have been overshadowed by Al-Qaeda. Yet a variety of evidence indicates that these groups are, at least in part, ideologically and operationally integrated with Al-Qaeda. This is not to suggest that Al-Qaeda and these groups are one and the same, as groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Sipah-e-Sahaba do have broader sectarian interests, but that their integration poses a problem moving forward. Second category of groups are what could be described as survivors or legacy actors. An entity like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, a group that has never really found a home and has been received a lot of different pressure, whether in Waziristan or in Zabul or northern Afghanistan. So they've been under an incredible amount of pressure, sustained a lot of different leadership losses, but they've also endured over the last 10 years as well. The group appears to have minimal capacity, but its status is not entirely clear. Particularly, an outstanding question is whether a group like the IMU with the downturn in Afghanistan will aim to conduct acts of regional jihad in Central Asia or support transnational operations. The last category, and perhaps the most important one, are what can be characterized as new outputs from the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Splinter groups, upstarts, and wildcards. It's helpful to think about this issue by looking back at the anti-Soviet jihad and the development of groups after that conflict. We need to remember that Al-Qaeda itself started as an organizational output from 10 years of war and conflict in Afghanistan, and that it took almost a decade for the group to develop, or at least half a decade for the far enemy strategy to crystallize. That record does not inspire confidence, especially when we consider that while the 1990s was the most important decade for Al-Qaeda in terms of its development, it also started as its quietest. In terms of early splinters, groups like the Islamic Jihad Union, who have emerged after 9/11, They've already attempted transnational operations, new groups like the Tariq Taliban Pakistan, in terms of the most significant organizational output from 10 years of war in Afghanistan. And lastly, wild cards, ethnic jamaats or smaller fighting groups in Afghanistan that fly under the radar more so than many of these other groups do. In conclusion, what does all of this tell us? I think the sole focus on Al-Qaeda, our sole focus on Al-Qaeda, is outdated and problematic. And just focusing on Al-Qaeda, we miss too much, especially when there are predictable groups that could fill some of the void or at least play a part in continuing Al-Qaeda's global jihad, either through Al-Qaeda or new mechanisms. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Don. Now that you told us our focus on Al-Qaeda is outdated, let's focus a little bit more on Al-Qaeda. Our next speaker is Colonel Yehaskel Sela. He is the former commander of the intelligence unit of the IDF Northern Command. He joined the IDF in August 1983, joining the Intelligence Corps. And after he retired from his military service, Colonel Sela joined the Israeli Counter-Terrorism Bureau. Colonel.
Good morning. After we heard the excellent briefs from my colleagues, I try to describe our part in this war, the CTB, the Israeli CTB, and how we define Al-Qaeda and the global jihad regional organizations as an enemy, and what we are doing to deal with it. So the CTB define those elements as an enemy, obviously, and we deal with defining the threat, the risk, try with the whole community to describe the scenarios, and when I say scenarios, is obviously against Israel, internal area, abroad against Israeli targets and Jewish elements, but we also aware by our international relationships with allies about what's happening abroad. Because one thing that we identify along the years, that the Al-Qaeda members are lessons learned, and they elaborate knowledge, elaborate experience from one part of the world to another. And it's very important because a raid like occurred yesterday in Libya might also occur somewhere in other place in the world against an Israeli institute also. So it's very important to share this knowledge, and this is also one objective in what we deal. It's very important to hear the opinions, our opinions about Al-Qaeda, where he stays, where they're going on, and I will be more than happy to share it with you later on, but I think that it's more important, if we got the occasion, to ask Zawahiri how he define where Al-Qaeda is, and how he conclude the period since he replaced Bin Laden. And I think that the answer of Zawahiri would be in a positive way. I think that although there are risks to Al-Qaeda, there are also a lot of advantages, and I think that this period, especially since the Arab Spring started, is a positive period for Al-Qaeda. In some places in the world less, in some more, but generally when we try to describe the long-term goals of Al-Qaeda, I think that in Zawahiri point of view, he's in the right way. He can be in a positive way that they might achieve it, maybe not in the next few years, but in the near future, in the long-term future, they in the right way. So in which terms they there? I think that Al-Qaeda is relevant, is still relevant. Although there is a very successful period of attacks, especially by the American forces against the Al-Qaeda seniors, from bin Laden to others, Pakistan, in Africa, and other places in the world. They still relevant. They're replacing the seniors, and they continue to deliving into their ideology to new societies along the world. And as an example, Africa in the last 2-3 years, and this is a significant increase that we see in this trend, the ideology of Al-Qaeda by those local global jihad organization spread. And this is an achievement. This is an example to what might occur in other parts of the world that till now we didn't saw activity or infrastructure like that from Al-Qaeda or from the global jihad. The second thing, here in the Middle East, we know the differences between bin Laden and Zawahiri by the priorities they describe to the warriors between the West, the Americans, the other countries, Israel, the Middle East, and the rest of the world. And we see, since the Arab Spring, but even before, that they focus in building the infrastructure along the Israeli borders. And they, although the risk, took the advantages in Sinai. They are in Lebanon. They fighting in Syria. The area of the Golan Heights might become an area like Sinai by the risk that it can expose to Israel. They still not achieve, but I assume that they would try or trying in Jordan. And we can see that in the whole countries along to Israel, along the border, the elements of the global jihad are there. So these are two achievements that he can put in his record. The next one is the decentralized of the Al-Qaeda building and structure. There is the seniors and the board in Pakistan, but it's an increase power of the regional units. And bin Laden didn't like it, al-Zawahiri opposed it, and he not oppose it. And we can see that there is a very big force and a very big tension of activity from those regional units. And I think that in the near future or in the future, they will build a structure of relationship and cooperation. So this might give a new definition to what we called in the past the net. The net, not just by members and recruits, but by organization units all over the world to the headquarters, if it will remain there in Pakistan or Afghanistan or other place in the world. And they really building a net that we didn't saw like this in the past. Syria, this is not the training because they fighting there, but this is the place that they recruit for. They fighting, there is ammunition, they get used to the tactics of the war, and from Syria they can explore it all over the world. What they are doing today in Syria, in Iraq, in Africa, those skills we might see in other places over the world also. So how we define the Al-Qaeda warrior or the Al-Qaeda organization today? They are very motivated. They always were motivated, but today not less than before. They will to kill. In Al-Qaeda or in the global jihad organization, there are no red lines. There are no limitations. They come to kill, not just Americans or Israelis, also their brothers, their Muslim brothers, like the Egyptian soldiers in Rafah. Like last month, they are killing. Who is not in their side, in the Sharia side, is the same. Their knowledge, we can't estimate. they can do something that is opposite to what we are think and estimate, and this is very bad start when we deal with an organization. We can't say today more than before why they don't doing attacks like in the NBC field or others. If it's from ignorance or because they just wait for the right time, or I don't know why, but this is a tension that we can speak about it before, where they going in the between the tactics and the tactical terror to the strategic one. We can solve this problem. They don't have problems of recruits from the Muslim communities, recruits from other religions who divert to be Muslims, and they increase the problems that we have to detect those recruits when they going back to their homegrown countries, and from there they can manufacture any attack that they want to. I don't think that they have crucial problem of financing, maybe sometimes, maybe to deliver it, but we saw by their magazines that there is enough to get $4,000 for create a strategical attack. So in these sums of money, they got no problems. If a senior is eliminated, somebody comes, his experience go with him, but the new ones got their experience, and they got their motivation, and they got their ideas, and we can say that I can see something that is different today than to the past. They are creative, maybe not so creative, but creative enough to challenge us. They're flexible. They succeed to frighten a large scale of societies, and they aware of our security measures and challenge it. So in the bottom line, in our point of view, there is a significant increase by the threat, especially for us, from the borders and others. They are here. They are here in the borders. They might be, and 2 years ago, Yoni Figel from this institute gave an excellent brief and he gave examples of Al-Qaeda recruits internal Israel 2 years ago, and since then I think that they just learning and becoming better, so we won't be surprised if they will try also internal Israel in the border. I said abroad, our officials, the Jewish communities we saw in Toulouse, we can speak about it later, what Marach did in Toulouse, they can do in many other places. The international traveling by sea, by air, the cyber area, the NBC. So, as we say, and maybe not just the sky is the limit, but I think that Al-Qaeda surprised us in the past, and unfortunately, if we will not continue to fight by policy and by tactical counter-terrorism measures, it will surprise us also in the future.
So, thank you very much, Colonel. And now we have our final presentation for this panel. I'm going to read out a little bit more this time from the biography because it is very beautifully written and very impressive also. Dr. John Bew is Reader in History and Foreign Policy at the War Studies Department at King's College London. In fact, he directs ICSR with me. He convenes the Foreign Policy Research Group at King's and runs an MA course on the foundations of British foreign policy, as well as teaching on modules relating to intelligence, terrorism, and counter-terrorism. He's currently running a series of seminars at the British Foreign Office on interpreting diplomatic excellence. From 2007 to 2010, Dr. Bew was lecturer in modern history, Harris Fellow, and Director of Studies at Peterhouse, Cambridge University, where he was previously a junior research fellow. 2009, he was profiled by The Observer as one of the rising stars of the historical profession, and in 2011, the Daily Telegraph named him, quote, one of the most exciting young historians in Britain. It continues. His most recent book on Lord Castlereagh, a former British Foreign Secretary, was launched by William Hague, the current Foreign Secretary, and praised by Jack Straw, one of his predecessors, as, quote, excellent. The current Education Secretary, Michael Gove, has described him as, quote, the best historian of his generation. More on his book. It was named as one of the books of the year by the Wall Street Journal, the Sunday Telegraph, BBC, and Total Politics magazine, and chosen by the Fondation Napoleon as Book of the Month for March 2012. It was also recommended in the Foreign Office Christmas reading list, featured on BBC Parliament's Book Talk, and described in the lead review in the Times Literary Supplement as, quote, unparalleled in its size and sweep, a life so nearly complete that it need never be written again. He's also written other books. John's previous books include Talking to Terrorists, Making Peace in Northern Ireland and the Basque Country, which was named by David Kilcullen in Foreign Policy's Global Thinker Book Club. So expectations are high now, John. John will talk about the global war on terror and the response to Al-Qaeda. John.
Thank you, Peter. I didn't realize you cared so much to put so much research into my biography. I'm not sure. In assessing the effectiveness of the war on terror, rather than simply summarize or synthesize the work of my colleagues, I'm going to shift perspective away slightly from Al-Qaeda itself, on which I bow to my fellow panelists, and then look instead at the long view, if you like, over the last 20 years, and more precisely how the war on terror has been framed, perceived, and implemented from the perspective of those states that declared it. Al-Qaeda as a foreign policy conundrum, if you like. Now, those states are, of course, primarily the United States, who articulated in the days after 9/11 the idea of a war on terror. Secondarily, the UK, the US's most visible ally and the state most involved with the various foreign policy ventures which have occurred since 9/11. Those are the two primary states. As a caveat, obviously, Israel shares many of the same concerns, is a key ally in terms of security and intelligence sharing. But what you can say, if you like, is that Israel, more traditionally, foreign policy and counterterrorism is more of a zero-sum game, and I'm going to expand on that slightly. Israel, for example, is not directly involved in Iraq, for example, and didn't face a sense of a new epoch after 9/11, if you like. It confirmed to Israel threats that it faced already, where there's a real sense of a sort of a watershed moment post-2001 in the UK and the US in terms of the terror threat. So in doing so, rather than simply giving a test case or an overall assessment of the balance sheet, the first thing that becomes clear is that there are so many concepts and ideas that fall under the banner of the war on terror. Some of them tightly bound to it, others more tenuously linked, and the variety is pretty dizzying. And even though President Obama has called an end officially to the war on terror in rhetorical terms, it hasn't ended in essence. And I therefore want to talk through both the first 7 years of President Bush's war on terror, but also more latterly the first term of President Obama's administration in that respect. So my aim is to offer, as I say, some broad opinions on the nature of policy making and the framing of national security strategies. The very term national security is a recent innovation in the UK, borrowed from the United States, chiefly with the end of illustrating, and this really is what I'd like to posit as an argument or a thesis, that since 9/11 there has been an unusual and unprecedented way in which foreign policy and counterterrorism have been blurred and become entwined in this period. And that really is an important innovation. And while this has led to many unfortunate consequences in the conduct of policy, I'm also going to suggest that it's equally difficult to disentangle those two things in the post-9/11 world, foreign policy and counterterrorism, despite actual sustained efforts to do so, particularly more recently with the Obama administration. So the first issue to address is, if you like, the big one, the question that Peter posed rather unfairly to Shiraz at the end of his talk, which is, how has the war on terror been effective? Well, it's very difficult, obvious, and this is an obvious point to make, it's very difficult to measure that in terms of tangible metrics, because it's shorthand for so much else, including, perhaps tenuously, the war in Iraq. But there is one way to look at it, and if you take precisely the war against Al-Qaeda, you can say that there has been some distinct successes, and my colleagues have addressed some of these. Key leaders removed from the scene of battlefield, either by targeted assassination or by arrest. Safe havens taken away, although other safe havens have sprung up. And at the bottom line, if you like, Al-Qaeda is unable to do what it used to be able to do in 2001. I think that's an important way to look at it. Precisely then, again, to take a historian's perspective, in terms of the threat to the West, if you take Al-Qaeda as an active organization of the last 20 years, of which it has sort of an obvious, tangible, recognizable existence, starting with the embassy bombings in the early 1990s through to the 9/11 through to the modern day, you could make the case that 9/11 was, if you like, the peak of Al-Qaeda core, or Qaeda Central, in terms of its potency against its chief targets. And its chief targets in those periods were Western targets. Now, the London and Madrid bombings are very important, and we'll come back to those. But Al-Qaeda core has not been able to repeat anything resembling the 9/11 attacks. And I think if you'd had 100 terrorism experts or analysts in the room with you in October 2001, the expectation would have been that another attack on the similar scale and of a similar species would be likely to happen. So no attack of the same scale, no attack of the same species. But that said, if you take another step back away from Al-Qaeda, the war against Al-Qaeda precisely as it was understood in the period shortly after 9/11, i.e. an organization headed by Osama bin Laden, the picture gets a little bit more complex. First of all, as a war on radical Islam, or war on radical Islamism, as some would like to frame the war on terror, you have to say, and this is in light of events yesterday in Libya, for example, that has been an unmitigated failure. And it was always likely to be an unmitigated failure, a sort of war of ideas, as others tried to frame that. Second of all, the metastasization of the threat, and I think my colleagues alluded to this. One of the defining security phenomena of the last decade has been the emergence of homegrown radicalization. Again, unexpected in 2001. And again, if you even take 2005, when there was a homegrown terrorist attack in the UK, the perception in the United States at that moment in time was that homegrown was something unique to Europe. And the United States had better integration policy and didn't have those similar threats. So that the growth of that threat, again, of what's sometimes described as Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism, first in the UK, but latterly had a longer gestation in France, of course, but latterly in the United States, has been something that no one expected in the days and weeks after 2001, and no one expected really in the United States, even in the mid-2000s. So in some respects, this is an organic or a generational phenomena which has little in terms of its core sort of history to do with Osama bin Laden precisely, more to do with second, third generation immigration in the West, more to do with concerns about integration, lack of national identity, more to do in the UK, a chief radicalizing issue was British foreign policy in Bosnia in the early 1990s. So it has that longer gestation. But also, as Alex has alluded to in talking about Anwar al-Awlaki, partly after the horses bolted, Al-Qaeda has attempted to fasten itself onto that development, to encourage that development. And you can see a sort of ideologically led Al-Qaeda attempt to reach out to young Western Muslims. As Alex said, not necessarily with the greatest operational effect, but still a presence. And I'd also say that when it comes to Al-Qaeda, homegrown isn't everything. We've had another metastasization of the threat. The perception really was that you have this sort of evolution of a threat from foreign fighters, trained jihadists, through to people radicalized by Inspire magazine, able to make a bomb on their own turf. Actually, more recently, if you look at concerns expressed by the security services in the UK, it's a return to the concerns about foreign fighters, those who have traveled abroad to fight, whether it be Libya, Syria, again, Afghanistan. So those concerns are still there, the traditional concerns, if you like, in the war on terror. In terms of characterizing the war on terror and how it's been fought, as I say, as a foreign policy conundrum, as I say, it potentially encompasses a huge amount, but to fasten it down as a war on Al-Qaeda, how might we characterize the way it has been conducted? Here I would first of all stress continuity. over the last 10 years through the Bush and Obama administrations, despite the vicissitudes of policy in Iraq and Afghanistan and the huge disagreements and arguments over those. At the core of the strategy, and this is not necessarily something articulated in or codified in official doctrine, I believe you can see two prevailing characteristics, and I think they've been relatively consistent. One is preemption, and the second is a focus on the threat on the periphery. So preemption. Initially, of course, the war in Afghanistan was a reactive response to 9/11. The idea that Al-Qaeda had a safe haven from which this attack had occurred, a reaction, if you like. But as time has gone on, increasingly the preemptive side of counterterrorism has come to the fore. And what is particularly striking about that, and we've heard lots of debates about the Bush doctrine of preemption, is that this is accelerated in the Obama administration. It's a different doctrine of preemption, but in terms of targeted assassination, it really is the core of the Obama administration's counterterrorism policy. High-profile killings of operational linchpins. We've heard about al-Libi and bin Laden, of course, most famously. Second, of course, in those theaters of conflict, the number of middle managers or jihadist foot soldiers who have been taken out of the field is actually huge, huge numbers. We're talking of tens of thousands in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and less so Yemen and parts of Africa. Third, it's not just been an operational thing. If you like, the Obama administration has stepped this beyond operations through to an attack on those fostering the ideology. Witness the attacks on the individuals responsible for Inspire magazine, who had varying levels of operational influence on the movement. So preemption, as I say, is reflected also in the structural aspects of the CT foreign policy apparatus and changes within that. Huge increase in drone strikes. For example, 60 CIA bases now have access to drone technology and the capacity to act upon that. There are more pilots in training in the U.S. Military apparatus, the Air Force, for more pilots in training when it comes to drones than there are for bombers and pilots combined. There's a huge shift of focus. And of course, a transformation of the Special Forces Command and a focus on capture, kill operations and night raids. And if you like, in terms of the legality of the question as well, it's expanded again beyond the initial squeamishness and huge controversies over Guantanamo Bay. In terms of the legal distinctions, assassinations, and boundaries there, they've expanded even further, and the Obama administration has pushed those further, albeit in a way that's sort of behind the scenes. As it's reflected in more precisely in President Obama's approach to Afghanistan, more laterally, the kind of situation killing capture approach, and I'd recommend David Sanger's book, Confront and Conceal, as a good, relatively dispassionate summary of that, and President Obama's approach to that. A kind of focus on Afghan good enough, if you like. No more hearts and minds. The coin phase of the operation was short-lived, and a transformation on emphasis on night raids and what John Brennan has called leading a counter-terrorism apparatus in Afghanistan. So I say dropping of this sort of hearts and mind thing. So the second aspect of the strategic approach, and it follows on logically from the first, is, if you like, a Churchillian idea of attacking a threat at the periphery. Now that, with Churchill and it's a traditional sort of mantra in British foreign policy right to the 19th century. But that with Churchill really got him into controversies and issues and entanglements in other areas. It even got Britain's most anti-interventionist Prime Minister, William Gladstone, stuck in Egypt for 2 generations. But the idea is you attack the threat, or you nip the threat in the bud as far away and as soon as it emerges. And I think that's been very strongly characteristic in President Obama's approach. So a different doctrine of preemption, not the Bush doctrine, not a doctrine of preemption exercised against states, but still that's a subtle shade of difference. It's still strongly preemptive and focused on the periphery. So all of this, in my view, particularly in the last 3 years, reflects a desire, I think, in the Obama administration, and an understandable one, to disentangle foreign policy from counterterrorism. So this, as I said, there's been this entwinement or contamination of foreign policy and counterterrorism has been one of the sort of issues and concerns and divisive issues in the United States. The Iraq War is sometimes seen as the most glaring example, but actually, if you look at Afghanistan, more so the shift there from a war of necessity, an attempt to remove the Taliban, to a nation-building exercise. You can see the contamination, the entwinement and entanglement of competing priorities. Because when counterterrorism becomes foreign policy, what happens is that it becomes loaded with all the same issues in terms of its construction and procedures. So it suffers from the same flaws, if you like. It becomes a product of ideology. It becomes a product of domestic political division. It also seeps into, as I say, domestic politics. Witness the controversies over domestic Islam, for example, and sometimes the confusion between that and a foreign policy. And the Northern Irish contrast here is really quite striking in the UK. In Northern Ireland, in 30 years conflict, as a counter-terrorism issue, it was by and large a bipartisan political issue between the main political parties. That has been transformed in the post-9/11 period. And again, that contamination, that seeping of counter-terrorism and counter-terrorism issues into the public domain, but also in terms of foreign policy, where counter-terrorism becomes an extension of what foreign policy is, which is a projection of who we are, what we stand for. And I think that entwinement, that entanglement has led to the perception that has caused problems. So, perfect. So to a certain extent, you might say that President Obama, in attempting to pivot eastwards, and that's the essence of his foreign policy, away from the Middle East, while focusing on this relentless killing, capture, peripheral, and preemptive approach on Al-Qaeda, is trying to separate the two. So there's much less faith in the Obama administration in the transformative rhetoric of the early days, the unclenched fist towards Iran is being clenched again pretty swiftly. And it is as if you like a zero-sum approach against Al-Qaeda. In a sense, much less ambitious, but focused on this unblurring of distinctions. And also very much more ruthless. Going forward then, what does this mean finally? Can you disentangle these two things, as the Obama administration has tried to do? Can you put counterterrorism back in a counterterrorism box? Well, probably not, in terms of the level of public ownership of these debates. Guantanamo Bay through to drone strikes, and the sort of stumbling way in which the Obama administration has tried to defend the drone strikes issue leads to a sort of lot of ongoing debates. The New America Foundation, a pro-Obama think tank, has said that 17% of deaths from drone strikes are civilian. So there's ongoing controversies like that, and I don't think you can put that back, that sort of uncomfortable extra-legal reality of counterterrorism back in the box. But also more broadly in terms of foreign policy, this idea of moving away from these entanglements which have led to this as threat and focusing on something else. I think, again, and finally, as a historian, I would say, actually, the consistency of the causes of terrorism and threats to national security are the same. It means that the same issues come up time and time again. You can't escape. Libya is an example of the fact you can't escape the debates over intervention and non-intervention. As Shiraz said, the same concerns recur of ungoverned spaces, failed states. And if you like, the sort of key conundrum there is how the United States and its allies position themselves in the sort of rapid changes in the Middle East. And the idea there is to put yourself on the right side of history, but that requires different levels of intervention, the use of force in some instances, an attempt to sort of find one's path in a very murky, conflated and confused place. So I'll leave you none the wiser on what to do, but those are some sort of broad reflections on the war on terror. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. It's exactly 11 o'clock now, and we'll have a break. We'll meet again at 10 past 11 in this exact room. We'll line up again like penguins and entertain you for the next hour and a half. Thank you very much.